So, Doug, I want to go back to Bordeaux a little bit. And, we are planning a tour there. And, if you want to, can you talk a little bit about, why, that region and what some of the interests in the region are wine-wise?
Oh boy, I don't know hardly where to start. I think Bordeaux is probably the most famous wine region in the world. If for no other reason than they've done such a good job promoting themselves over the last couple of centuries. But the thing about Bordeaux wines is that they're pretty dependable. You know, I love Burgundies. Don't get me wrong, I love Rhone wines, but they're sort of sketchy. In other words, you buy a bottle of Burgundy and it might be fabulous or might not be. In Bordeaux, you're more likely to have pretty consistent product from year to year. Some years are obviously better than others, but the other part is that in Bordeaux, they made their reputation by shipping wines mainly to Great Britain and Holland and Belgium by sea. Back in the days when that was a big thing, and so they developed a huge client base in those countries for their wines. And what David and I went there about a year ago now to explore and meet some people in both the right bank and left bank. And you know, for a place which is doesn't have big mountains, doesn't have spectacular scenery, it's really very pretty. You know, the vines are rolling hills and valleys, little hills and valleys. The chateaus are attractive to look at. One of the things that's changed in recent years is that Bordeaux, the city, even though it's a wine business center, has been for a long time, it was always not very interesting. Didn't have great restaurants, didn't have a big art scene, but that's all changed with the new generation of winemakers and politicians and businessmen in the area. Bordeaux has become, the city has become a pretty trendy destination. You know, you can be there in 3 hours from Paris by train and so forth and so on. So when Dave and I were there, we had trouble finding a hotel room. We thought we had reservations in one hotel. It turns out I had made it for the wrong year. so, so we had reservations in 2021. But anyway, so we got to the hotel. They had no room. So she said, check here, check there, check there. She called around several places. And frankly, we ended up, sort of a last resort in a small hotel by the train station. So,
twin beds.
Yeah. so, and then they have a beautiful wine museum, the Wine Expo Museum there, which is a place to learn about wines of Bordeaux and some of the history of the place and the places, the terroir and the wines and the winemakers. And so really it's become quite a destination, which makes it more interesting. Now that's on the left bank. On the right bank, it's beautiful. You know, it's got real pretty hills. It's got quaint villages. The village of Saint-Emilion, for example, is just drop dead beautiful. It's up on a hillside, has vines coming down all sides of it, great shopping, a lot of wine shops, amazing restaurants in town. It's just a beautiful place with all these limestone buildings. And then you go up in the plateau where Pomerol and the adjacent towns are famous for their wines. And, it's a beautiful place to spend time. And the wines on the right bank, mostly Merlot based with Cab as the blend and others as the blend. The wines are delicious. They're very approachable even when they're young. And they last, for decades. Some of the most famous vineyards are there, Cheval Blanc and Chateau Ausson. Of course, Petrus is in the adjacent town of Pomerol. And Petrus has some of the most amazing wines ever made, most expensive, certainly. So anyway, it's a fun place to visit. In between the two is a Entre-deux-Mers, between the two seas, between the two rivers that come together in the confluence at Bordeaux. And Entre-deux-Mers is a very pretty place. It's rolling hills and beautiful foliage and flower gardens and vineyards, of course, a lot of vineyards. A lot of white wines are made there, Sauvignon based, and then the red wines are very inexpensive and well regarded. So it's unbecoming. It's a pretty place, and in the tour, we'll travel between left bank and right bank over Entre-deux-Mers and spend a little bit of time there to meet some winemakers in the area. One of the things that's happening is that the winemakers in some of the more expensive areas like Saint-Emilion are finding vineyards in some of the adjoining areas like in Entre-deux-Mers and Castillon and Franx, and they're opening wineries there and vineyards there, growing some pretty amazing wines at a small percentage of the price of some of the fancier wines in Saint-Emilion. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of beauty, there's a lot of friendly people. There's 11,000 chateaus making wine, so you can kind of take your pick. And I didn't even mention the sweet wines in Sauternes and Barsac. That's a whole different story up on the Garonne River. Talk about some gravelly areas. And the wines are just amazing, made from Semillon and Sauvignon Blanc. And so we'll spend some time up there as well, learning about the sweet wines, but also the dry white wines of the Grave and Barsac.
Hey, Doug, can you review briefly the classifications of the Bordeaux wines? Because I want to compare that to Napa.
Well, in the 1865 classification, you have the Premier Grand Crus. There were 4 of them, and now a 5th was added with Mouton Rothschild. But there's 5 Premier Grand Crus, mostly 4 of them up in Pauillac and Margaux, and then 1 down in Pessac-Léognan, down right adjacent to the city of Bordeaux. And then they have 5 different levels of Grand Cru, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th level of Grand Cru. And then below that, you have the Cru Bourgeois, which I mentioned before, with 250 or 60 vineyards that have become well known because they're really making good wine. In many cases, better wines than you might find in some of the classified Grand Crus.
So that classification is old. It's about 150 years old. It's been rather robust. There's not a lot of pushback from the various vineyards. I'm sure they'd all like to be elevated, but I think they more or less accept their position. So in Napa has the Napa designation itself is an AVA, and then there are these 13 or 14 sub-AVAs below that. And a couple of years ago, I suggested, wouldn't it be helpful for the people who are coming here, not just to have a Napa wine or not just to have a Oakville wine or a Rutherford wine or a Stag's Leap wine, but we could have some kind of a classification like they do in Burgundy with Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Village, or like in Bordeaux. Well, I was almost put on a log and tarred and feathered to be run out of Napa. They are, at the moment, very happy with the branding that they have. Yeah. One branding is Napa, and then the other branding are the various AVAs. Yeah. And then you go to the various vineyards. And I guess you have to realize that although Napa did produce wines in the 1800s, they really didn't get up and running till Robert Mondavi built the first winery post-Prohibition in 1966. And most of the vineyards that we see now in the wineries, they started in the early 70s, 80s, many of them in the 90s. So they're really very, very young. And so there is this sorting out, and there's a lot of horse trading going on, and corporations are coming in and buying it. And I'm beginning to get some phone calls and have some talks with various people. So I think that eventually there will be a classification in Napa that goes beyond just the AVA.
Well, on the right bank in Bordeaux, they do it differently. They were not part of the 1865 classification at all. On the right bank in Saint-Emilion, for example, they taste the wines every 10 years and have a classification based on what they find. And so in theory, some vineyards move up the chain and others move down according to the quality of what they're doing right now. So unlike in the left bank where it's been the same for 150 years and so be it, on the right bank, why it's they've got more pokers in the fire. Now, what happens when a vineyard goes down from one level to the next? Well, it's bad news. It's very political. It becomes, oh my God, no, you made a mistake. You got a bad bottle, et cetera, et cetera. And we've been doing this for centuries, and on and on. So there's a lot of give and take with the politics of it. But in fact, it's easier to move up when you have superior wines than it is to move down when you're not quite making the mark. But the word gets around that so-and-so, well, they didn't, they're fighting it because everybody thought their wine wasn't quite as good enough. And so it's much more, I don't want to say competitive, although it is, but it's much more contemporary in terms of.
Well, this is on a 10-year cycle, like the Guit Hachette, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. Every year they rate the wines.
Oh yeah, they sure do. Yeah. And
what you're describing is something different than that.
Yes, that's what I'm describing. The 10-year process is something which the Association of Winemakers in Saint-Emilion does on their own. So it's a professional society of the winemakers themselves deciding on what's going on. The Guit Hachette is a marvel in itself because every year they taste about 30,000 wines. Every winemaker in France is allowed to submit 3 wines for evaluation by the panels. There's a separate panel for every single AOC. So if you're in some little AOC in the middle of nowhere, there's a panel of people who are expert, who have decades of experience on the wines from right there. So in fancy places like Saint-Emilion or Pauillac, these guys they taste every single wine, 3 from each winemaker, and some make the cut and some don't. So it's interesting that each year there is this live evaluation of everything. It's quite, to me, it's much better than have one person like Robert Parker, for example, is the primo member of this category. Where you have one guy who tastes, even though he might have superior tasting ability, he has his own preconceptions. He has his own preferences. Whereas in the Guit Hachette, they have a team of people for every OC. And so there's discussion between, well, what do you think about this? I don't know about that. Let's try that again, et cetera, et cetera. There's give and take, and then finally they come up with their recommendations. And so it's, to me, a very powerful way of evaluating the quality of wines every single year. Okay. And sometimes the coup de coeur, the favorite wine of the whole group for an AOC might be a fancy wine, or it might be a relatively unknown wine that's quite affordable. You never know.